Just shy of 20 years ago, my wife purchased me this little shark in Belize. I was currently getting ready to work for a marine biology degree, so it just made sense. Plus, who doesn't love sharks? On the bottom of the shark, it's labeled as being made of Zerakote wood. I have no idea what that is, or, anything about it, but it's a really pretty wood, so I really liked it. Over the years, this poor shark has gotten so beat up and so many little pieces have snapped off of it that I decided it was time to make it into something better. So I started taking it apart, snapping the fins and the face off, and just getting it ready to go. I decided to make the shark into a pen since there wasn't a lot of wood left on the shark, but I knew it would be just enough that I'd probably be able to make one, if not maybe two pens out of it. I started by first prepping the barrels, so I simply took these and ran them across some 220 grit sandpaper, just enough to scuff up the surface and allow the super glue to really get in there. Next, I measured these against the body of the shark, and I thought that I could really get a pretty good amount out of the tail section, but first I needed to cut the head off so that I could safely cut the shark in half without it jumping into the blade. Next, I double-checked my measurements on the shark's body and prepared to go ahead and cut him in half. To do this safely, I put the flattest part of the shark against the sled and made a shallow pass going a little more than halfway through it. This way I could hold the other side with my hand securely, and if it were to jump or bite or fly off, it wouldn't take my hand with it. Then I simply reversed this process on the other side, holding it down with my right hand and holding it loosely with my left hand, but it cut through like butter. Then I took the tail section off just to make sure that I had the exact measurements I needed for my pen blanks from the shark. After that, I decided I wanted to try to cut the tail section in half to see if I could actually get two pens out of this shark, which means if one of these pieces is too thin, it's not going to work. Next, I inserted the proper 10mm sized cutter and went ahead and got this thing clamped up so that I could take it over to the drill press and start drilling through. My drill press is always so short that I end up needing to put a block of wood underneath to help raise it up that last half inch to get through the bottom of the blank. However, when I pushed the barrel into this to test it out, turns out it wasn't wide enough and I did bite out the end, so unfortunately I'm only going to be able to make one pen out of my beloved Belize shark. Now it's time to super glue the barrels in place, and all I need to do is put a little bit of glue down inside the wood, roll it around so that it gets every surface coated, and then put my barrel all the way in. Once the super glue had set, I went back over to my drill press and replaced my 10mm drill bit with a 10mm barrel trimmer. This thing is carbide tipped so that I can always replace the carbide bits if it ever starts to run dull, but also I like to make sure that I go through nice and slow, get all the super glue out of the barrel first, and then go ahead and trim down the edge. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you only go down to where the edge of the brass fitting is showing. You don't want to cut into that because then you might start getting into issues with your pen not fitting properly, but as long as you just barely get that gold sticking out, it's going to be awesome. Now it was time to finally get it on the lathe. So I've already got my bushings set up in the proper order so that I can make sure that I'm cutting it to fit the pen kit exactly the way it's supposed to. I always put the long barrel on first, get everything set up, and then put the shorter barrel on and go ahead and tighten everything down. I like to tighten it down just a little bit with a wrench. That kind of helps make sure that everything is gripping exactly the way it's supposed to. And then I move my headstock into place and just give that just a little tiny bit of a twist, not to really put any pressure on it, but just enough to get it in place, and then get my stuff ready to go, make sure I've got some clearance, and then I always go ahead and get my gouge sharpened up just a little bit more. I want to make sure that when I'm first cutting these edges that I have a nice sharp edge to be able to cut right through these without breaking any pieces of the wood off and ruining my project, especially since I only get one shot at this one. So I want to make sure that I take off the high spots first, and since they're really high and they're spinning really fast and I don't know how dense this wood is, I just took my time and just barely took off a little tiny bit at a time until I could really see and feel that I had rounded it over, and then I could start being a little more aggressive. It turns out this wood has really tight grain, but it seemed to actually be relatively soft, or I just happened to have my gouge sharpened really well, because it cut through this stuff like butter. I got very little resistance and generated very little heat, but I did still also take my time, because again, I want to make sure that I do everything right on this project since I only get one shot at it. Now it's time to start sanding. So I usually go through starting at 150 grit, up to 220, up to 350, and then up to 400, and that gets all the initial scratches and everything out and really cleans up the wood. After that, it's time to get into the finish sanding. So I start with 1,000, move up to 1,500, 2,000, and 3,000. And this is what I go through to get all of the micro scratches out and make sure that this wood is absolutely just smooth and basically polished looking on its own before I even apply the final finish. The final finish is added by putting it on a piece of 4,000 grit sandpaper and sort of wet sanding the entire surface with the finish. This helps prevent any last final scratches. Even though it's so thin, it still just helps the surface to not dull. It also takes away the dust while helping it to penetrate the wood. Then it was time for final polish, and I did this by putting a little bit of the wax shellac mixture onto a super soft paper towel. I like to rub this into the surface and then get it spinning at full speed. I like to use the towel to help make friction, and that's going to help provide some heat, which will blend in the waxes and set the shellac so you get a nice shiny finish after a couple of coats. Then it was time for final assembly, and that was pretty easy if you just simply follow the instructions that come with the pin kits. Now, I like to use a Bessie clamp to actually put these together. So once I get all the pieces deconstructed and taken apart and fit loosely where they're supposed to, trying to make sure everything is lined up as straight as possible, I put it in the clamp and then I begin to twist down and get everything permanently set. These pins don't use any glue or anything, they basically just use a press fit that holds everything together. The good news is that once you get them together, they don't come apart, which means the bad news is once you get them together, they don't come apart. So you have to be pretty precise when you're actually doing all of these steps, but I've been doing this for a while, and so I'm getting pretty quick and pretty good at it. And there it is. What a beautiful pin. This thing turned out absolutely amazing. It is stunningly beautiful. The video doesn't even do it justice how pretty it is in person. I think the color is actually richer than the original shark that I had, which is awesome. And I'm just so glad that this gave me a great way to be able to keep this piece in my life, even though its former life is, well, no longer.